a nice you should all see a nice slide saying representation in the curriculum at Key Stage 4 and 5, because that is what I'm going to talk about. So just to start off by introducing myself. So my name is Claire Holliss, and I am the Head of History and Classical Civilization at Reigate College, which is a sixth form college in Surrey. And I'm just going to start off by talking a little bit about what I'm going to talk about in this presentation, and then just give you a bit of an insight into my context and why we are doing the work we're doing. So in this little talk, I'm just going to start off by talking about why I think representation is such an important aspect of the curriculum and of our curriculum planning. And I'm then going to talk a little bit about how I've been approaching it in my department, particularly at Key Stage 4 and Key Stage 5. So just before I begin, though, I just wanted to kind of put all my cards on the table. I am a history teacher. I'm a trained historian. I do have a classical civilization A-level, and I have taught the imperial image course in my current college. So I have some insight into the classical civilization course, and I'm going to try and talk about the relevance of some of the examples I give to classics. A lot of the examples I'll use of practice will be drawn from the history courses we teach. I have some examples that Sarah, our course leader for classics, of the work that she's been doing as well. But in the process of putting this presentation together, it's really brought home to me even more than I previously thought how much our curriculums speak to each other in history and classical civilization. So I'm hopeful that this will give you some ideas that you can then adapt and use in your own contexts. So just to begin, the slides is going to change. Okay, here we go. Just to begin then, so giving you the info about where I'm working. So in our department, we offer 2 A-level courses in history, the early modern and modern history, using the AQA course there. And we teach the OCR classical civilization course. We have also taught Latin at GCSE and as an entry-level qualification. Unfortunately, that got discontinued, so we're sort of currently doing it as a bit of an enrichment activity until we can find an alternative. And I have been, in my capacity as head of department, but also with other outside organisations like the Historical Association, I've been doing a lot of work recently on this question of representation in the curriculum. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to start off by talking to you about why I became really interested in that. So I'm going to start off then by telling you a little bit of a story about a lesson that went really badly wrong. Now, before I begin, this wasn't the only moment that made me interested in representation. I've been thinking about it for a while, but this lesson really brought home to me why I thought why representation was so important to the students' understanding of a particular period, and also their ability to think about it and reason about some of the questions that we were posing to them. So the lesson was in my first year of being HOD, and I was teaching for the first time through our British Empire course, which we teach as part of our modern history A-level. And I was really looking forward to this lesson because I had been sort of wading through the 19th century political history, which isn't my favourite period, and we'd finally got to the events in India, which I had some background knowledge about. So I was really up for this, really looking forward to it. And the lesson that I was teaching to introduce this part of the course was on the events of 1857. So apologies if any people know about this, but just to give a brief summary. In 1857, the British East India Company's rule in India becomes seriously challenged because their sort of rapacity and general kind of like arrogance and misrule finally annoys a large number of people enough to launch a general revolt against them. And this revolt almost pushes the British East India Company out of power in India. Their sort of control is only really saved by intervention by the British government. So this is a pivotal moment, both in Indian history, but also in the history of the British Empire. And I also knew that there was a really juicy question of interpretation that I could use to drive this lesson. So these events are called three different things by historians. In the British historiographical tradition, it often gets called a mutiny, with the implication then that it was mainly isolated to the army, and that this was a kind of dispute that had its origins and mainly played out in a military context. In the Indian nationalist tradition, it often gets called the First War of Indian Independence. And again, the subtext there is that this was a general national revolt where there was an attempt to overthrow British rule, and that it was therefore kind of setting a foundation for later nationalist struggle. And then there are some historians who sort of split the difference and call it a rebellion, saying it's something a little bit more than a mutiny, but something a little bit less than a national independence movement. So I thought, this is cracking. This is a really nice question that I can introduce at the start of the lesson, get them to return to once they've looked at the events in more detail. And it's also, with my sort of historical discipline hat on, it was also a nice way of kind of introducing to them the idea that interpretations are often lurking in what we choose to call things. So I thought, brilliant, that's great. Went into the lesson and was really disappointed by what happened. And the problem was the resources that I had to teach this part of the course. So I was mainly relying upon the AQA British Empire textbook, which has subsequently been reviewed, thank goodness. But its account of the events of 1857 essentially talked in a certain amount of detail about, well, not much detail. It mentioned economic problems, didn't really specify what those were. They mentioned that the various Indian nobles and princes were annoyed with the East India Company rule, but again, didn't really specify any individuals, and spent an awful lot of time talking about the problems that were caused by rumours about gun cartridges that were spreading around the army, that these gun cartridges were greased with beef or pork fat, thus obviously offending the religious sensibilities of Hindu and Muslim soldiers. So with those resources, we did various activities, and then I asked the students to write a paragraph just explaining the causes of these events in 1857. You can probably predict what happened. Gun cartridges are kind of the sort of thing, the sort of little detail that always creeps up in student essays anyway. And almost all of their accounts, this was mentioned as kind of the sole cause, the primary cause, which was a bit of a problem because I knew that really wasn't the full story. Also, when we got to the end of the lesson, I asked them to engage in this debate over interpretation. The students really didn't have much information to be able to kind of argue the case for calling it anything but a mutiny. So I went away feeling a bit like, okay, a bit deflated. That didn't really go how I wanted it to go. So I knew I was teaching it again to a different group later on in the week. So I thought, okay, I'm going to go home and I'm going to see if I can find some other information, some other stories that I can add to the lesson that will hopefully allow my students to think a little bit more carefully about what's going on. So I found two stories. Firstly was one that hadn't been mentioned, the story of the Rani of Jhansi, or Queen Lakshmibai. And her story allowed me to bring in issues where the East India Company were seizing lands from Indian rulers via something called the doctrine of lapse, but also the general tenor of it, company policy towards kind of essentially trying to push out local rulers, etc. I also had mentioned in the lesson Mangal Pandey, who is essentially often credited with starting the revolt within the army. but who'd been mentioned in that capacity, but didn't really have much of a backstory. So I went in to flesh out his story a little bit more, to give more details, which allowed me to talk in a bit more detail about the economic problems and about some of the wider caste and religious issues within the East India Company's army and in wider society. So I brought those stories in as an act of trying to represent in a little bit more detail the Indian perspective on what was going on. So adding those into the next time I taught the lesson, and then looking at what the students had written, yes, the gun cartridges were still there, but the writing, when compared to the writing the previous class had did, was so much more nuanced, so much more sort of carefully considered, and a much more convincing historical account. Likewise, at the end of the lesson, when I asked them to re-engage with this question of naming, again, some students still thought it should be primarily called a mutiny, but there was a lot more variation in views, and the argument was a lot more informed. There was a lot more sort of ability to have a detailed discussion of this question. So I've chosen that little example just to kind of, as a kind of sort of case study, really, as to one of the main reasons why I think representation is so important in the curriculum. The representation of stories which might otherwise be left out, which were, in this case, left out of the prescribed textbook. And that is that it serves the students better. And it serves the students better in two ways. Firstly, it gives them a much more accurate and complete picture about what is happening in a particular period. So the students in that second lesson had a much more detailed idea about what's actually going on in India in 1857 by learning about the stories of people who've been sort of left out of the accounts that they'd initially been presented with. But also, I think it's crucial for student thinking. It allows them to reason about a particular event more effectively. Adding in more detail about the Indian perspective on these events allowed students they gave them more information and equipped them better to engage in discussions about causation and discussions about interpretation as well. To add a little extra detail about that, I've also found that representation, adding in sort of neglected or comparatively neglected stories, is really, really good at squashing misconceptions. And these might be some that you guys have encountered in your own classroom. So the perennial one where students come to us thinking, oh yeah, well, women's economic roles and political roles, etc., are very recent phenomena. Again, representing women's stories in different times periods can, completely correct that idea quite easily and give them a better idea about the world of the past in that respect. Ideas that students have, again, even in A-level classes, about people living very static lives, both in the ancient world or in sort of medieval times, early modern period. Again, teaching about the full range of people in particular societies, people who have moved, people who are on the move, again, can help students actually question those sort of preconceptions that they have about how the past works. One example I'll give, again, relates a bit more to modern history, but I'm sure you guys can think of equivalents in your contexts. When we teach our British Empire unit, students always come to us, well, quite a lot of students have come to us and said, we had no idea that World War I was a global war, in spite of the name, because they'd learnt about it primarily as a event happening on the Western Front in Belgium and Northern France, with Europeans fighting each other. And now we are teaching it to them as a conflict where there are front lines in modern day Iraq, the front lines in Turkey, front lines in Africa, and the people who are part of the colonies or the colonized world are also engaged actively in this kind of conflict. So it's also not just about giving students a fuller picture of a particular period. It's about giving them a more nuanced picture of the world of the past as a whole, and allowing them to question some of the generalizations they might have formed just from popular culture or their previous education there, which again just adds to their knowledge, adds to their ability to think carefully about the world of the past. And then there's one other aspect as well about why I think representation is so important. And that is that I think it represents and reflects the discipline better, and I think that's also important. So one of our jobs is obviously to ensure that the students we teach emerge from our from their time with us with having had a good historical or classical education, and in the case of people who are where we're teaching Key Stage 4 and Key Stage 5, they are equipped to do well in the exams that they need to sit. But I also think part of our job is we are sort of ambassadors for our particular disciplines. We are representing what history or classics or ancient history is to our students. Sometimes we may be the last time they really engage with these subjects in depth if they are moving on to do other things. So I think it's also really important to reflect the discipline to them as accurately and completely as we possibly can, both in terms of what we know or what historians or classicists know about the eras and developments and events that we teach, the full picture, or at least a fuller picture, but also what the current state of scholarship is in the discipline. And I know this is true for history, and I think it's also true for classics. A lot of the really exciting work that's being done by people who are working in the field at the moment is focused on representing comparatively neglected stories. And so I think that is also an important element of representing that this is what history and classics looks like as they are currently practiced to our students there. And just a quick note about terminology. I've used the word representation without really explaining why I use that word rather than diversity or inclusion, etc. And it's partly because I think I really want to make the link clear here that we are representing a more complete story of particular periods. We are representing what the state of our disciplines more effectively. And that is one of the central aims and one of the central things that this work of trying to include or diversify actually achieves. So that's why I tend to use that sort of phrasing. Essentially, it means very similar things to diversifying and including comparatively neglected stories, but that's the word I tend to use instead. Okay, so that is my sort of why. That then brings us to the question of how, because it's all very well for me to sit here and go, yes, we need to kind of represent these kind of comparatively neglected or underrepresented stories in our curriculums, but how do you go about doing it? Particularly, how do you go about doing it at Key Stage 4 and Key Stage 5? Now, I've obviously had to think about that because I teach at a sixth form college, so I just teach Key Stage 5. And this presents a few more complications. Looking at the work that history teachers have done, a lot of the work that has been done on representation by other people in this sort of history teacher community has tended to focus on Key Stage 3 because it's more flexible. There are comparatively lower stakes. There's not an exam at the end. And therefore, it's been easier for many teachers to focus their energies there, which obviously means that once you hit Key Stage 4 and Key Stage 5, you almost can be taking a slight step backwards and narrowing the curriculum once again. And some of the things which stop people working at Key Stage 4 and Key Stage 5 and building a representation are firstly the requirements of the exam specification. So particularly when it's quite a crowded specification, this idea that we've got to get through all of this content and we can't therefore really build in any more representation. Secondly, this idea that we've also got to prepare the students for the exams, so therefore we need to be spending time doing that. And I know, whilst being aware of those key issues, I have found over the course of the years that I've been looking at this in my context, there's actually, if you look for them, there are actually quite a few opportunities that can be found, even in spite of the restrictions imposed by specifications and by the requirements of the exams. And there are two broad approaches that I've taken to trying to build in representation in my context. The first is something that I call routine representation. The second is something that I call deep representation. So I'm just going to talk you through both of these approaches and how I've used them in our department. And also I'm going to hopefully touch on how you guys might use them in your contexts too. So the first approach is something that I call routine representation. And this essentially just boils down to taking what you already teach, taking your existing specs or your schemes of work, and then just adjusting it to include a wider range of stories. How can you build these stories in to your existing plans for teaching? And the example I'm going to give here is drawn from our teaching of the French Revolution unit. So in our early modern course, we teach the breadth study is on the Tudors, the depth study is on the French Revolution, and then there's the coursework unit. And the example I'm going to talk about comes from a section where I teach about the constitutional monarchy. So the revolution is happening in 1789, but it's before France formally becomes a republic in 1792. So there's an attempt to build a constitutional monarchy in France. Now, the French Revolution course in general has certain flaws. Well, one of them is that it doesn't actually mention anything happening in Haiti, despite there also being a massive revolution happening there. That's just not present. But also, I flipped through the textbook a few months back just to kind of have a quick, just out of interest, and I managed to find a mention of 5 women. Now, this is a problem because women were pretty active throughout the French Revolution. So their lack of appearance in the prescribed texts and in the specification, again, is not really giving students a full picture about what's actually happening in politics in France in this period. So how do I go about trying to correct that? So what I did was I didn't change the spec. We carried on with the sequence of lessons as we were planning them, but all I did was just add in a couple of key texts which were additional to the content that we would ordinarily cover. And the first of these texts was the petition of women of the Third Estate to the King in 1789. Now, I put this in here as part of a lesson we were teaching about the run-up to the calling of the Estates General in 1789. So essentially, this kind of emergency meeting of representatives of the nobility, the clergy, and the Third Estate, who are everyone else, because France is almost bankrupt in 1789. And it's this meeting which kind of like then leads on to the outbreak of revolution. And part of the process is that the members of the nobility and clergy and the Third Estate were asked to put together registers of their grievances. And I found this wonderful document that was put together by women of the Third Estate. It wasn't an official register of grievances. Women couldn't stand for election. They couldn't actually attend the Estates General, but they had nevertheless emulated the other groups and put together this register of grievances anyway. And why I thought it was so important to include this was in terms of what it illuminated. Firstly, it demonstrated to students that women were active and engaged in politics at this stage. But also in terms of when you cross-referenced this document to the other documents that were put together by the men of the Third Estate, it was really interesting to cross-reference areas of common interest, areas of difference. It just gave students a more of a fuller picture of what the Third Estate, so what the kind of the main population of France cared about at this point. Likewise, later on, when I was teaching about the establishment of the Constitution in France and the Declaration of the Rights of Man, I also put in a document put together by Olympe de Gouges, where the Declaration of the Rights of Women. And again, this just added a different perspective. It illuminated to students both the fact that Olympe de Gouges is using similar Enlightenment ideas to the ones in the official documents, so showing the spread of how far these ideas have gone through society, but also how people were receiving the Constitution and how they were responding to it. And the key thing I want to emphasize here in terms of this routine representation, in both of these instances, the inclusion of these documents that were put together by women, in this case, who weren't being represented in the kind of primary spec, added extra detail. It illuminated stuff to the students that they would otherwise perhaps have missed or not understood had it not been for the inclusion or the representation of women at this moment. And I think that's a really important perspective to take when you're thinking about routine representation, because often the fear that people have when they're doing this is, am I just being tokenistic? Am I just sort of, okay, oh, there's not enough women, let's just try and shoehorn some women's stories in. By thinking, okay, well, where are the opportunities, but also what is it that including these stories of women or what any other underrepresented theme or group, what is it that it can do to help my students' understanding? How can it actually push them further? Is, I think, a way of avoiding these problems of just putting stories in for the sake of it. These stories are doing work. They are having an impact on students' understanding. So now, again, health warning here. I've taught the Imperial Image course, but again, I am not a trained classicist, so I'm going to just talk in very general terms here. I just had a quick look for the purposes of this talk at the sort of the spec for the Imperial Image course. That's the one I'm more familiar with. And just thinking about if I was sitting down with this spec, how would what opportunities would I think about? How might I think about how doing a bit of routine representation would expand my students' understanding or illuminate themes they might miss? So looking at kind of like the culture hero stuff, talking about representing perhaps the stories of a cross section of Roman society, including the lives of the urban poor, again, might be really interesting in sort of getting students to assess the extent of Augustus's kind of like rebuilding projects in Rome, how far he is trying to kind of change or supposedly reinvigorate Roman culture, etc. Looking at sort of like a geographical sort of spread, representing stories from parts of the kind of empire which might not ordinarily be covered, might allow students to think about how far this peace and plenty idea, how is it everywhere? How far is this kind of like, this supposed golden age affecting the empire as a whole? Looking in the Pater Patriae sort of section, obviously I imagine lots of you look at the lives of women in this section, but also thinking about, the elite women, like the ones in Augustus's family, but also again think about other women across the empire, across a wide range of social groups, to again think about, okay, well, who are these who are Augustus's families meant to be role models to? What are the ideas behind this, and how far are they being accepted as role models and sort of like seen in that way by a wide range of Roman society? So again, just very sort of general terms there, but I think that kind of just shows you the sort of reasoning that you might apply, thinking about, okay, these are the ideas, how far are they representative, what stories can we include from other groups to sort of add extra detail or query some of the kind of ideas that are being put, that these students are engaging with. And that brings me down to kind of some actual concrete examples. So these are things that I've spoken to with Sarah, our course leader for the classical civilization course that we give, that we offer students in terms of what she's actively doing at the moment. So in the Aeneid course, she's been using the story of Nisus and Euryalus in book 9 as a sort of springboard for discussion of same-sex relationships in the ancient world. So thinking about sort of how people would have read this story, how it might have been received in different societies, adding an extra dimension to the text and by looking at its context, etc. So that, and therefore representing a really interesting theme in sort of like discourse about the classical world. this was something I observed Sarah doing when we went to a recent trip in the British Museum, looking at the Marrowhead, both in terms of a piece of propaganda for Augustus, but also looking at its destruction and its sort of the role played by the Nubian kingdom of Kush, and sort of what it tells us about therefore relationships between the empire and other groups. And then also looking at this is something that Sarah was doing in the Odyssey part of the course, looking at differing depictions of the sirens in ancient art, and then comparing them to later art in the Renaissance as a sort of way of thinking about classical reception, but also looking at sort of attitudes, the depiction of women, and what's the comparison of their depictions in classical sources compared to later sources. What that sheds light on in terms of how women are portrayed and seen in these different societies. So that's sort of the routine representation side of things. The other approach I take is a little bit trickier. And so this is something that I call deep representation. So if you are looking at routine representation, you are taking your schemes of work, you're taking your specs, and you're going, okay, we're going to teach this as previously planned, but we're going to make some adjustments to it to try and bring in these underrepresented stories. For deep representation, what you're doing is you're kind of going back, you are, taking your scheme of work and you're going, okay, let's replan this. Let's start from scratch, putting these kind of neglected or underrepresented stories at the heart of the inquiry or the sequence of lessons. Now, obviously, this is where things get more complicated with ensuring you're covering the requirements of the exam specification, ensuring that you're doing all you need to do in order to make your students successful at the end of it. It still can be done, but it requires obviously some more careful thinking, and it requires some more kind of quite a bit of creativity. So this is something that I'm very gradually doing with the history curriculum and sort of discussing with Sarah in our classics curriculum as well. But just to give you, I want to give you an example now of how it can be done. And one of the ways, which is actually quite interesting, because I was just listening in on your discussion earlier, one of the ways in which I found it's a path through this is to use scholarship and to use interpretations to kind of guide or drive inquiries and sequences of lessons. So the example I'm going to talk to you guys about now comes from our teaching at our Tudors unit. So again, this is part of our early modern course, and this sequence of lessons is taught to the students in year 13. Just again, to give a bit of perspective on this, part of the AQA breadth study is a requirement for students to answer a question on 3 interpretations, as you guys were discussing earlier, and to use their own knowledge to assess how convincing those interpretations are. So the section of the course that I was looking at, it was a section where what was known as the marriage question was dealt with, and how it particularly related to Elizabeth's relationships with Parliament and her Privy Council. So how Elizabeth's sort of status as a female ruler complicated questions of her marriage, and how that complicated politics more generally. Now, again, this really emerged out of a sense of frustration with what the materials that I was working with, and also and the materials that were being set in the exams. The broad sort of argument that seemed to be kind of in the textbook and that was being presented in these extracts that were appearing on previous exam papers was that Elizabeth was very isolated, almost unique as a reigning female monarch, and that this problem of her gender was primarily a problem that had to be resolved, and was particularly sharp as an issue when it came to questions of marriage and the succession. Now, I knew that was part of the story, but I had enough own knowledge again to know that wasn't the full story. And I'd actually happened to have read, when I sat down and to look at this part of the scheme of work, a book by a historian called Lisa Hilton. And this book is called Elizabeth Renaissance Prince. And Hilton's thesis is that Well, firstly, Elizabeth is not as unique as we might assume she is. She's actually part of almost a trend of female monarchy in Europe at the time. But also that she was able to navigate the question of gender a lot more easily than might be suspected, because of her status as a ruler allowed her to access this kind of concept of being a prince. And Hilton shows these kind of documents where Elizabeth is calling herself a prince from a line of princes, and that this is almost a gender neutral category that Elizabeth can inhabit, and therefore almost kind of overcome some of these problems of her gender and how it links to politics. So I thought, this is fantastic. What I'm going to do is I'm going to reimagine this inquiry, and we're going to put this question of gender at the heart of it. And this is not a theme that students normally engage with as a really kind of at the heart of discussions in kind of the examined units in the history A level. It's something that's sort of discussed as a side issue or a side question. So we're going to put this at the heart, and we're going to start off by setting up a debate between Hilton and two other historians who had appeared on a previous exam paper over how gender and over how that affects Elizabeth's rule. And so that was the first kind of key aspect. Then we were going to, in the next part of the lesson, teach the content that had to be taught, that was on the spec. So about the marriage question, about how that relates to Elizabeth's relationships with her Privy Council and her parliaments. So that, in that part of the sort of scheme of work, that allowed me to cover both the sort of skills of the analysis of interpretation and the critique of interpretation, but also the central knowledge about the marriage question, etc., that was required for the students to cover as this part of the course. But then, rather than leaving it there, I decided to go a little bit further. So I decided to add another sort of double lesson in. Firstly, on looking at the European context. So actually, is Elizabeth alone? Well, no. There is Mary of Guise in Scotland and later Mary Queen of Scots. There's Catherine de' Medici in France. There are other sort of female regents in the Netherlands, etc. So actually, female rule is comparatively common in Europe at the time. Then looking at sort of ideas of gender and sexuality in 16th century Britain. So how far is Elizabeth able to overcome these ideas because of her status as being a ruler? How far is she still bound by them? But also, do these operate in ways that we might expect? Does the notion of gender in 16th century England map onto what we might expect it to? And then to use that to return back to the interpretations and go, okay, let's have a look. Who's right, Hilton or these other two historians who appeared on the exam specs? So that's just kind of one example of how you might do it. And I think the central thing here is just in terms of practicality, we were still including the kinds of interpretations that appeared on the exam papers, but we were also putting up an alternative perspective. We were still including the core content on Elizabeth, the marriage question, and the impact that had on her broader political kind of context. But we were also saying, well, actually, here are some other aspects of the picture to consider. But through it all, we're taking this notion of gender and we are problematizing it. We're saying, okay, is this actually a problem for Elizabeth? Is this actually a kind of, how does this actually operate in terms of female rulership, but also more widely? Again, allowing students to engage with a theme which they might not have actually explicitly engaged with in their historical education before, and certainly not at GCSE and A level. So, just to quickly look through. So, I also then went through and did a quick sort of like audit of how far this would actually help students with the exam. And I was able to find a couple of exam questions that I thought would be directly relevant to the content that we taught them. So firstly on Elizabeth's style of government, secondly on her levels of political skill. But also, I mean, so this is just another kind of perspective. I also firmly and pretty passionately believe that the outcome of an A-level course should not just be, oh, the students can go into the exam and do well on it. It's also obviously important that they leave having had a good historical or classical education, understanding the period of study in detail, and also of the kind of interpretations and scholarship related to it. So I think thinking about that as well as an addition, as an I would say equally important goal of A-level study. This kind of work, this kind of deep representation can really play dividends in helping them in that respect too. Okay, so just looking at the time, yeah. So just in terms of thinking about how you and what you might do in classical civilization here. So again, one of the things that I from my experience of teaching the classical civilization course and of sort of talking to Sarah within my department about it, one of the things that might be an opportunity is the requirement to include modern scholarship, which is interesting because I know you guys were just talking about some of the problems it threw up. But in terms of thinking about how you might use recent appraisals of key topics, particularly ones which take into account more neglected or underrepresented themes or stories, and using that as a driver of a sequence of lessons might be an approach that could be taken that would allow you to kind of be a bit creative with the curriculum while still sort of covering what you need to cover. Other kind of approaches, one of the things that I find that works in history, which may well work in classical civilization too, is using ideas of similarity and difference. So taking the central story that you've got to teach, whether that be about sort of like, Augustus, whether that be about, something from the World of the Hero course, and placing it up in the context of, how far does this represent the full range of options, the full reality of the period or what's going on at the time. So that allows you to kind of cover the narrative you need to cover, whilst also opening up alternative stories which you're kind of placing in opposition to it, and therefore opening up the question of how representative it is. And then other things, again, I think in looking at the classical civilization course in particular, thinking about selections of sources, selecting sources which might illuminate neglected themes, or which might come from slightly less represented places, or have links to slightly less represented stories, setting them up in opposition to some of the prescribed sources can also, again, potentially be a really powerful driver of a sequence of lessons in terms of thinking about the alternative perspectives and range of experiences that might be linked to these kind of artifacts as well. Okay, so just very quickly, there's one other kind of aspect I wanted to talk about, and that is the other way in which I think representation can be important and can help in understanding the discipline. So a lot of the examples I've just given you have been focused on giving students a better and more complete idea about a particular period. So either Elizabethan England or the France during the Revolution. But I think also this representation can play a really important role in expanding students' understanding of what the discipline of history or what the discipline of classics looks like, and the kinds of work that historians, classicists, ancient historians do. So I'm just going to very briefly talk about our new NEA course. So NEA is the non-examined assessment or the coursework unit in the AQA History A level. And because we are given pretty much freedom to choose, we are currently able to design a whole new course for our students in order to prepare them to write their coursework. Now, this is going to be replacing a unit on civil rights in the USA, which we've taught, but which we were getting increasingly sort of frustrated with as something that the students had perhaps already covered, but there wasn't really doing much to expand their historical understanding. So instead, we've designed a new course about civil rights in the United Kingdom, particularly about the positions of women, the LGBTQ+ community, and Black people in Britain. opening up the question of how far their positions were transformed during the late 19th and 20th centuries. So there's a couple of reasons why we've done this. Firstly, in order to allow students to explore the histories of these groups, which it's not impossible, but it's perhaps less likely they would have encountered in their previous the history curriculums they've previously covered, particularly at Key Stage 4 and Key Stage 5. But also to give them an alternative history of the 20th century. So they'll have probably covered it as sort of like, a period in which you've got World War I and World War II, maybe the interwar period. They might have looked at the suffrage movement. They might have done a little bit about social change after World War II, but it's primarily been a kind of military, political, economic history. And to sort of say, well, that's not only part of the story. There's also a story of widespread social change as well, which is an interesting perspective to take. And the other key thing that's linked to this question of discipline and the knowledge of the discipline we also thought that it would be useful in allowing students to access relates to some other requirements of the NEA course. So our coursework unit, in their essays, the students are required to analyse 3 primary sources. So whether they will select between, after we've taught them the full course, combining all 3 of the themes, they will select from the women's rights, LGBTQ rights, or Black British rights questions. And as part of putting together their essays, they'll need to assess and evaluate some primary source material. And this was a real opportunity, we thought, because again, up to now in the history spec, they will have primarily dealt with sources like speeches, letters, sections of law, etc. Really primarily kind of, again, politically focused sources, mainly drawn from kind of national archives or official kind of archives or collections. So we thought, well, here's an opportunity to get students to look at sources that can be things like items of clothing, posters, flyers, badges, ephemera, the sorts of sources that historians working in these fields, looking at sort of like women's history or queer history, might look at routinely as sources of evidence. But also sources which are collected as part of community archives rather than official archives, and therefore which have perhaps slightly more precarious existences. Again, allowing students to engage with questions of historical preservation. What gets preserved? What gets destroyed? And what does that mean about what we know about the past? Then the other additional aspect of the coursework is that they are required to engage with 2 interpretations. And again, this will allow them to directly engage with historians who are working on fields that they haven't really encountered before. So working on women's history, working on Black British history, and to consider their specific research methods, their particular approaches that they take, just to kind of add an element of their historical education, which might previously have been not as present, and to give them a much more well-rounded sense of what the discipline actually is and the kinds of questions and the kinds of evidence that historians actually use. So obviously the coursework option isn't necessarily on the table for you guys at the moment, unless they change specifications. I do think, I mean, this is one of the areas that I actually, when I compare our history specifications to the classical civilization specification, I'm rather envious of, because themes like family life, social organization, emotions, their expression, sources of evidence from art, literature, popular culture, these are kind of naturally inbuilt and integral parts of the subject, in contrast to history courses, which still, unfortunately, primarily focus on political and economic themes. So I think there's almost an inbuilt advantage, and certainly lots of inbuilt opportunities for students of classical civilization and ancient history, etc. as well. So if I'm just going to kind of sum up what I've covered so far. Firstly, I think representation is really is fundamental and crucial to giving students a fuller or more complete picture of the world of the past, whether that is the medieval world, the modern world, the ancient world, the classical world. And I also think it can be so useful in helping students to reason more effectively about the questions we're posing to them. In terms of how to approach building representation into a curriculum, I think particularly at Key Stage 4 and Key Stage 5, I think the key thing here is to look at the specs, look at the schemes of work, find the opportunities, and think about, okay, what is it that the representation is going to do at this stage? How is it going to illuminate something about the ancient world or the classical world to students which they might otherwise have missed? How is it going to allow them to engage the questions you're posing to them in a more informed way? And how is it going to give them a richer understanding of what's actually going on in the discipline of classics, of ancient history, as it is currently being practiced? So that's overall the main things that I wanted to kind of discuss here. I know we've got some time here, so I would like to see if there are any questions. I'll bring up the chat, so you can put some ideas in the chat if you'd like, but also just feel free to just shout them out to me. I will just stop sharing my screen so I can see people's faces and take some questions that way. So just bear with me. There we go. Excellent. So I'm just going to open up the chat. Right. Okay. So are there any questions? So I'm just looking in the chat and see if there's anything there.
This is more of a comment than a question at this point. First of all, thank you so much. That was really interesting.
That's no problem.
I've tried to do some diversification of our Key Stage 3 curriculums. This is, like you say, it's equal to do in some ways. One thing, just an observation, is that we've just switched from doing Greek arts, doing Invention of the Barbarian, which I think is, as a module for Class Civ, is amazing at giving, this is what the Greeks say about barbarism, and this is what the Persians say about their culture, and comparing and contrasting. But I think one of the great things about the A-level course is you teach Homer, you teach Virgil, then we do love and relationships as well. You look at Greek art, and getting the pupils to bring in ideas from outside and elsewhere in the course is really quite helpful for, as you say, talking about representing different people in the community. So yeah, I think this is definitely a really useful thing for us to think more deeply about. So thank you.
Yeah, I think it's. I mean, again, looking at sort of like, as I said at the end, looking at some of the options available to you, again, from a perspective of sort of like, looking at these courses available for history A levels. There's some really interesting themes that I think we could stand to include more of. I think, from my perspective as well. One of the reasons why we've been thinking about it in our classical civilization courses is that, particularly in things like World of the Hero, etc., it's nice to try and build a representation to all of the courses, because obviously not everyone feels equipped to pick some of the things like the mention of the barbarian, etc. So yeah, I think it's one of the things that can be done in classics is to select some of these units, but I think also all of the units can potentially have more representation built into them too. But yeah, no, it's really exciting to see some of the options on the table in classics. Yeah. So I'm just having a look at some of the questions in here. Have your ideas been supported by senior management? So by and large, I am very fortunate in that my SLT are very supportive of everything that I've been trying to do. And I think part of it is because I have rooted what my arguments for increasing representation in terms of how it is going to assist students' understanding of a particular period of the, but also how it's going to help them think about historical questions more carefully. So I think rooting our arguments in the needs of the discipline that we're teaching can be a really powerful way of persuading people that this is kind of an important use of our time as curriculum planners. In terms of other subjects, yeah, I mean, obviously I work closely with obviously classics is part of our department, so we work closely on that. We've had some conversations with English in particular as well, because some of our there are some crossovers, and we've had in terms of some of the themes that we cover. I don't do enough working with other departments than I would perhaps like to. So that's certainly something I'd like to work on a bit more. Other things here, yes, in terms of AQA, we're looking at the issue of representation in various specs. Yes, I think one way, the ideal way that this could happen would be that the exam boards would kind of reform specs and produce more options. They're the only, from a history perspective, when we look at exam boards which have included more varied kind of courses, I'm thinking particularly about the African Kingdoms module and things at GCSE like the migration and the people units. One of the problems there is take up. Often in case of, unless requirements are made to teach a certain geographical spread or teach a certain different range of themes, sometimes teachers can departments can play it safe. Understandably, they've got quite a lot on their plates, etc. And so that's why I think you can't necessarily always rely upon individual exam boards to change specs. That's obviously a very good thing when that happens, but it also is a matter of also empowering teachers to think about what they're already teaching and adding representation there as well. In terms of thinking about whether I have seen increased thinking or a shift in attitudes to the discipline, I think in terms of sort of in terms of having hard evidence, it's quite hard to kind of identify to have a sort of base of evidence here in terms of I'd obviously want to have to take a lot of kind of evidence from students who before we made any changes, and then ones that which students we're currently teaching, and to contrast them. I do think, I mean, in terms of the when I'm teaching some of the units where we've built in more representation, there tends to be perhaps a more critical attitude to things like the textbook. I've sort of where I've had students occasionally ask me, well, why isn't it, why are you bringing in extra materials? Why isn't this in the textbook? That has kind of, which is quite interesting in terms of allowing students to kind of critique what the actual course that they're doing as well. And certainly I think they've enjoyed engaging with some of the kind of questions of interpretation and adding new perspectives into those questions when they discuss them. Yeah. In terms of sort of like, so enslaved peoples or ethnicities in the units. So I think, I mean, again, I don't have a huge amount of expertise to talk about specifically the classical context. I think in terms of when I think about sort of like the work we've done in the history unit, really when sort of dealing with sort of these less represented or more hard to pin down kind of stories, it has really been a question of having to go away and read a lot of sort of scholarship to sort of pick out these kind of stories. So if I think about our British Empire unit, a lot of the work that we've done has been involved sort of trying to expand the range of scholarship that we're reading, including reading a wider range of scholarship from around the world in order to kind of get some of these new perspective or information. So it is a slower process, and it's one that certainly you can't do overnight. I mean, certainly if I think about our kind of curriculums, it's still very much a work in process. And I think, it's important to take time over it and get it right, rather than sort of rush to try and sort of put in changes which aren't going to work there. Are there any other questions? Some really good, some really interesting ones so far. Do you feel to just shout them out or put them in the chat?
Well, it sounds